Welcome, everyone, to episode 34 of Ohio Unsolved. I'm your host, Matthew, and I've got another crazy one for you guys today. First, I have a story about a still missing girl from Ohio, and the second is a murder that was loosely inspired by the movie Scream. If you're coming from the Facebook group, Strange and Hidden in Ohio, thank you for coming to check out my podcast, and I truly hope that you enjoy the stories. Now let's just get right into the episode. Everyone sit back, make sure to lock your doors and windows, and get ready for Ohio Unsolved. Our first story is about the mysterious disappearance of Shailene Farrell. On August 8th, 1994, Shailene Farrell went missing. At 10 a.m., Shailene left her home in Piqua, Ohio, to drive to the nearby grocery store where she worked to buy an iced tea. She left her house driving her mother's 1981 silver Chevy Malibu. The car was later found in the parking lot empty. Her mother reported her missing when she didn't show up to her shift that night at 7. Before her disappearance, she was living with a friend since she had moved out of her parents' house after her mother caught her smoking marijuana. However, she kept in close contact with her family and moved back in with them several weeks later. Initially, police speculated that Shailene had run away from home, but her mom and her best friend disagreed, as she did not take any identification, money, or clothing with her. The police eventually determined that Farrell is likely a victim of foul play. Suspected serial killer Christopher Below is a suspect in her case. Christopher is incarcerated in an Ohio prison for the involuntary manslaughter of Kathy Fetzer, whom he admitted to shooting at his home. He has been suspected for also being responsible for the disappearance of Mary Cousteau, Chrissy Porco, and Heather Teague, although he has not been charged with any other cases besides Kathy. Serial killer Larry Dwayne Hall has been listed as a suspect in her case as well. Larry is speculated to be responsible for the disappearances for up to 45 women during the 1980s and 90s. He is currently incarcerated at a North Carolina federal prison for the 1993 kidnapping and murder of Jessica Roach. He has not been charged for any other murders besides Jessica's, however. To this day, Shailene is still missing. It's suspected that she was murdered, but because no body has ever been found, no one knows for sure. She would be 46 today. I hope that one day she is found, whether dead or alive, to at least give her family some closure. Our next story is about the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard. On September 22, 2006, Cassie Jo Stoddard was stabbed to death by two of her classmates, Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamick. After spending most of his childhood in Utah, Brian Draper moved with his family to Pocatello, Idaho. That's where he met Tori Adamick when they both were students at Pocatello High School. Both boys were interested in films, and they started recording on their own. The victim, Cassie Jo, also attended the same school. She and the boys were both juniors. On the night of September 22nd, 2006, Cassie Jo was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle, who were out of town on vacation. They had hired Cassie to come and take care of their 3 cats and 2 dogs for the weekend. Cassie Jo was visited that evening by her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, who arrived around 6 p.m. Later that night, classmates Brian Draper and Tori Adamick, who were both aged 16 at the time, came over to the house to hang out. Cassie Jo gave the friends a tour of the house, including the basement. Then the 4 teens went into the living room to watch the movie Kill Bill Volume 2. But Adamick and Draper ended up leaving before the movie ended, saying that they wanted to watch a movie at their local movie theater instead. Cassie Jo and her boyfriend both stayed behind. Cassie Jo was unaware that before the boys left, Draper had unlocked the basement door so that he and Adamick could re-enter the house undetected. Sometime after leaving the house on Whispering Cliffs, Draper and Adamick returned to the neighborhood, parked down the street, got out of their car, and put on costumes consisting of dark clothing, gloves, and white painted masks. The boys quietly entered the house through the basement door while the couple were watching television in the living room. They intentionally made a loud noise in an unsuccessful attempt to lure Beckham and Cassie Jo downstairs so they could, quote, scare them. Next, they found the circuit breaker and they turned off the power in the house, hoping that the pair would come downstairs to check the breaker. When Cassie Jo and her boyfriend did not come downstairs, the boys turned some of the lights back on. Cassie Jo became uneasy after the temporary power outage, and her boyfriend noticed that one of the dogs kept staring down the basement stairs, periodically barking or growling. Seeing that, Cassie Jo felt scared. Her boyfriend called his mother to ask if he could stay the night at the house with her to ease her mind, but she denied his request. Instead, she offered to let Cassie Jo come home with him and stay at their house for the night, and she would bring her back to the house the next morning. However, Cassie Jo felt that it was her responsibility to stay at the house, as she was hired to do so and care for the animals, and she declined the offer from her boyfriend's mother. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Beckham's mother picked him up, leaving Cassie Jo at the house alone. Her boyfriend called Adamick's cell phone to see where he and Draper were, possibly to meet up with them later. Beckham said that he could barely hear Adamick, who was whispering on the phone, and assumed that the boys were in a movie theater. From the basement, both Draper and Adamick could hear Matt Beckham leave. The teens then turned the lights out again at the circuit breaker and waited, hoping that Cassie Jo would come downstairs to turn the lights back on. She did not. Eventually, the boys went upstairs. Draper was armed with a dagger-type weapon, and Adamick had a hunting knife, the weapon having been purchased at a pawn shop. Draper opened the door and slammed a closet door at the top of the stairs to try and scare Cassie Jo, who was lying on the couch in the living room. The boys then brutally attacked her, stabbing her approximately 30 times. 12 wounds were potentially fatal. During the investigation of the murder, police found that Draper and Adamick had recorded their plan to murder Cassie Jo in advance on videotape while they were at school. This video footage was shown at their trials. Draper and Adamick were arrested on September 27, 2006, and they were both charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. During the interrogations, each teen blamed the other. Draper claimed that he was in the same room with Adamick when Stoddard was killed, but denied stabbing her. He then later admitted to stabbing her under alleged commands from Adamick. He would lead the investigators to Black Rock Canyon, where the youths had disposed of the clothing, masks, and weapons that they used for the murder. At the trial, the prosecution revealed that Draper had said that he was inspired by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who committed the Columbine High School massacre. Later, Adamick was said to have been inspired by the Scream horror film franchise. Draper was convicted on April 17, 2007, and Adamick was convicted on June 8, 2007. On August 21st, based on being convicted of first-degree murder, each received a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and 30 years to life for being convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. Both of the boys' attorneys filed separate appeals at the Idaho Supreme Court in September 2010 for Adamick and in April 2011 for Draper. Draper was seeking to have his conviction vacated or to be given a limited life sentence that would allow for his release on parole if approved after 30 years. The first appeal for both Adamick and Draper was denied in a 3-2 decision. The High Court vacated Draper's conviction on conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, saying that jurors were given erroneous instructions on that charge, but they affirmed his conviction for first-degree murder and life sentence without parole. In July of 2015, Adamick gained a hearing for post-conviction relief with State 6th District Magistrate Judge Mitchell W. Brown. He claimed that testimony from character witnesses could have changed the outcome of the sentencing, but that his former attorney, against his parents' wishes, chose not to call upon these witnesses. Adamick said that his attorney believed that the prosecution would have submitted even more damaging evidence. In March 2016, Judge Brown denied his request for post-conviction relief. Adamick appealed Judge Brown's decision to the Idaho Supreme Court, which on December 26, 2017, rejected Adamick's appeal for post-conviction relief and upheld the district court decision. Following the Idaho Supreme Court's decision, Adamick filed a federal writ of habeas corpus in January 2018, in which he argued that the court denied his first appeal based on a theory that was not presented to the jury. Adamick also argued that he should be entitled to a new sentencing hearing in light of the Miller and Montgomery decisions. Federal Magistrate Judge Candy W. Dale presided over Adamick's writ, and on November 25, 2019, she denied the writ. Adamick is currently appealing Judge Dale's decision to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, with oral arguments taking place on February 7, 2022. Our next story comes from YourGhostStories.com, and it's one person's experience with a poltergeist. When I was about 14, my friend Kaylee and I were staying at our friend Kylie's house out in the country. There was an old house near that we wanted to go and explore. It was nighttime. My friend Kaylee was too scared to go and stayed at the house. Kylie and I got a flashlight and we walked out. It was a long walk to get there. It was dark, so we couldn't see a lot with our flashlight, but it was a very run-down house and there were toys all over the yard. There was a beat-up car and a shed. We tried the door to the house and we decided to go inside. The first room was a kitchen, and to the right was a stairway. The walls of the kitchen had holes in them and reddish-brown splatterings of things on the wall. We weren't sure what it was, but it was on the refrigerator as well. We opened it up and we found the same reddish-brown stuff inside. We got kind of freaked out and we went outside again. We heard something and we took off running back to her house. When we got there, we told our friend Kaylee about it and decided to go back the next day while it was light out and check out the upstairs. We decided to go to sleep, and my friend Kylie and Kaylee took the twin bed, and I was lying on the floor. I had been trying to sleep for a little bit, with my back turned to my friends. Suddenly, I felt my blanket by my feet moving. I sat up because I thought it was Kylie's cat, but the cat wasn't in the room. I had asked my friends if they messed with my blanket, and they said no and laughed at me. I didn't believe them, so I laid on my back this time, and I kept my eyes open so I could try and catch them. Suddenly, the blanket was yanked down on my foot strongly. My toes were forced to the ground. I screamed and I got up onto the bed with them and turned the lights on. There was no way that they did this because I had been watching them. They didn't believe me, so I ended up just sitting on the bed with the lights on and staying up all night while they slept. I was so mad that they didn't believe me. The next day, when we went back to the house, we saw a large circle of stones around a large mound of dirt with a cross sitting on top of it. There was a tire swing that moved back and forth, though there was no wind, and even the leaves weren't moving. We went back into the house to show Kaylee the reddish-brown splatter, but she wasn't convinced of anything. We were all too scared to go upstairs, so we came back outside and I stepped off the porch onto what I thought was another broken step. When I looked down, it was a headstone. Why there was a headstone lying by the porch, I have no idea. When Kaylee saw that, she started to believe. Kylie and I went into the shed, and there were really weird drawings and markings all over the walls that were glow in the dark. I started getting really scared at this point, and I started running back to the house. My friends were close behind me. I'm just wondering if maybe something followed Kylie and I back the first night and was messing with my foot. I know that it happened. I wasn't dreaming. No one else could have done it, and I was terrified. My friends still don't believe me to this day. Has something ever happened to any of you and no one believed you? Our final story is another poltergeist encounter. In 1987, I was living in a house in Atlanta with 4 roommates. We lived there for just over a year, and during that time, we had several experiences with what we later became convinced was an actual ghostly presence. The house that we were renting was well over 100 years old, having been built sometime just after the American Civil War when Atlanta had been burned and destroyed by Union forces. The house was a beautiful old Victorian home located in an area of Atlanta known as Inman Park. We were all pretty young, in our 20s, and trying to get started in our respective careers. So the prospect of sharing the rent for a wonderful old 2-story, 5-bedroom house with a full basement was an attractive one. 1 week after moving in, we were all asleep in our rooms when we were awakened by screaming from our roommate, who I'll call Hannah. We all jumped out of bed and went into Hannah's room. She was sitting up, saying that she had woken up to see the dark figure of a man standing next to her bed, looking down at her. She said that when she had screamed, the figure turned and walked out of the room. she was very scared and highly agitated. Myself and the other male roommate immediately checked out the inside and outside of the house, but we could find no intruder. This happened around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We finally got Hannah to calm down, and everyone went back to bed. The next day, we just chalked this up as a first incident to the nervousness about living in a new home that just happened to be a creaky and somewhat spooky old antique house. However, Hannah would not hear of that explanation, and in the ensuing days continued to insist that she had seen this dark figure standing by her bed. She refused to stay in the house alone after that. About 2 weeks after the first incident, we were all asleep again, when suddenly there was a very loud crash and the sound of tinkling of glass from the hallway that separated all of the bedrooms and a common bathroom. Once more, we all jumped up and ran out into the hall, where we found that a full-length mirror that had been mounted on the bathroom door had shattered into hundreds of pieces all over the floor. Since everyone had been asleep, we could not figure out how this happened, as the mirror frame was still securely fastened to the door, and only the glass itself had broken. Atlanta is not prone to earthquakes, and the street was not a busy one, so we ruled out the possibility that a large truck or something had passed and caused vibrations to occur inside the house. Later, similar poltergeist activity would manifest itself in many other ways. There was one instance when I was home alone in the house watching television, when for no good reason that I could later ascertain, 3 candles that were sitting on the fireplace mantel suddenly fell off onto the floor, almost as if someone had slept them off with their hand. Then there was a phenomenon that we all experienced at one time or another, where personal objects and other items would go missing, only to turn up later in a place where the owner would swear that he or she had not left them. On one occasion, missing car keys were found lying right in the middle of the person's bed after a thorough search had been conducted for them by everyone in the home. Other strange activity came in the form of knocking and tapping sounds heard coming from either the attic or the basement, when it was certain that no one was in either space. The last incident that involved the sighting of an actual entity occurred about 2 months after we had moved in. We were having a small party at our place, and a house guest, who none of us had met prior to the party, was taking a personal tour of the place on her own. She suddenly came running up from downstairs, saying that she had just seen a man standing in the corner of the basement. She said that when she had called out to him, he simply disappeared. We immediately went down to the basement to check, and of course, found nobody there. This was the most interesting, because there was only one entrance into the basement, and a person who might have been trying to play a trick would not have been able to escape past anyone without being seen. As noted, that house guest who saw the figure in the basement was a brand new acquaintance whom we later determined had no prior knowledge that our place had any sort of unusual activity connected to it. After about 6 months of all of this, things seemed to quiet down, and no more ghost activity was noticed or reported by anyone. We began to convince ourselves that maybe, just maybe, we had all overreacted to some degree, and perhaps we were all just being overly imaginative about the whole thing. Finally, toward the end of our time living in the house, my wife and I were out at a restaurant one evening, having a drink and dinner. We struck up a conversation with another couple sitting at a table nearby. 2 people who were complete strangers to us, and whom happened to meet that night by total chance. When they asked us where we were living in Atlanta, we told them about our place in Inman Park. They said, "Really? We used to live in Inman Park. What street do you live on?" When we told them, they said, "That is interesting. We used to rent a house on that same street. What is your address?" When we gave our address to them, they said, "Oh my God, we used to rent that exact same house ourselves." Immediately followed by the woman saying, "Have you seen the ghost yet?" Well, you can imagine that both my wife and I were completely flabbergasted to have received such validation about our ghost problem from two complete strangers. We ended up comparing notes with them, and they told us about many strange happenings that they had witnessed in the house that were quite similar to our own. That experience thoroughly convinced me that there really is something to the whole subject of ghosts and afterward. I no longer dismissed similar stories that I had heard from other people quite so easily. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. First, I want to apologize for the shortness of this episode and for my mush mouth. I don't know what's going on. I've tried several takes on everything and I just kept mushing everything up, so I figured this is as good as it's going to be this week. I hope everyone did enjoy the stories, though. And if you did, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. A 5-star rating really helps others to find this podcast. Make sure that you join us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. If you do enjoy the show, please consider joining the Ohio Unsolved Patreon, where you'll get instant access to monthly bonus episodes starting at the $5 tier and up. Now, I know that I slacked last month on the bonus episode, and I do apologize for that. I will have 2, possibly 3 bonus episodes during the month of July. I'm going to make sure that I get those out there for everybody. But once again, thank you all for listening. And make sure to keep your doors and windows locked and stay ready for Ohio Unsolved.